So let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that we've heard from incoming students in the past, especially for people, for this transition into graduate school, and also maybe a transition back to school, is studying skills and test-taking skills. And so we're going to kick off the day with something very serious, but with some very enjoyable presenters. And they're all fourth-year doctoral students, Evan Kruger, Daniel Dupuy, and Jenna Vendran. And they have very interesting interests, but I'm going to look at my cheat sheet so I don't get them wrong. Danielle is investigating legal and community system pathways that facilitate or prevent violence and trauma among South LA youth, among other things, I would say. And Jenna is studying the relationship between stress and trauma in childhood and mental health and substance use outcomes in adulthood. Got that right? And Evan is studying issues related to LGBT health disparities and is particularly interested in social stressors such as stigma and discrimination and their impacts on health. They also are very successful students, so they know what they're talking about. So, turn it over to them.
So hi everybody and welcome again. My name is Danielle, as Dr. Prelit mentioned. And I think that what we're I want to first start by saying, I don't know that anything we're going to say here is necessarily going to be novel to you. I'm sure a lot of you will have thought about some of these things before and anticipated like how study skills might change and how test taking might change from undergrad to grad. But hopefully we can provide you with some just useful tips or tools, and of course if you have any questions throughout your time here, we're still around, please feel free to reach out to us and share our contact information at the end. So I think we want to start off with a more global perspective. And I don't know exactly what you guys talked about yesterday, so some of this may overlap, but obviously there's a difference between grad and undergrad. You're going to really kind of shift in the things you talk about and the way that you talk about them. It's going to go more on theorizing and really taking concepts and applying them to public health problems. And so you're going to do some really critical thinking in this stage. It's going to be harder work, but it's going to be worthwhile. And so it's more of a depth than a breadth than you're used to in undergrad. So I think that's just like important to keep in mind as you go through the program. So the way that we're going to talk about study skills and test taking is that I'm going to start with a more global perspective, and everyone is going to follow techniques and some exam skills as well. So, right. So I'm going to start with talking a bit about self-awareness and how the program is, like really paying attention to the culture of the program, and then Jenna's going to go into techniques. Some of the slides cut off a bit.
Yeah, we made these really beautiful slides on Google Drive, and then this room doesn't have internet, so we had to download them, and so I wonder if we can,
Yeah. So, and this is just really an outline of the day, anyway. Sorry about that.
There we go.
And we're going to get down to testing specifics, and we're going to actually go through some examples at the very end. So we're going to take some test questions and kind of go through them and talk about the techniques we use to answer them. So maybe
I think the rest of them are not cut off, so maybe we should.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. It's an adventure.
Right. Welcome to the adventure. Okay. So, and before I even go into this, I just want to say that everyone here wants you to succeed, and so I think that's really important to know that you guys can create your own culture of how you move through the program. It can be very supportive, and everyone can win, everyone can get an A. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there for the mentality as you go through all of your classes. But one of the first things that you should just take stock of when you're thinking about your study skills is really think about why you're here and how what you're doing is going to be applied to your eventual career. And really keeping that purpose in mind at all times. It can get easy to get lost in the minutia of maybe stats, be like, ugh. But it's all contributing to your eventual skills post-graduation. And so here, what experiences and skills do you bring, and what are you looking to gain? This is really just thinking about when you go into each class, what your strengths and weaknesses are. And so, for example, if you are in a class where you might have to get with a group, you're going to have group projects a lot. Your skills that you may not want to pair with people who have the exact same background as you, for example. Like, you're going to learn more if you pair with people who have different sets of skills and backgrounds in your group projects, for example. And then, of course, what environments do you study best in? You want to find those now. Like, for me, I'm a coffee shop person. I'm not a library person. Like, I cannot study when it's just super silent. I get fidgety. I want to do something else. I need like motion and some music, and I need those things. So I identified like coffee shops all around where I live now, and the school that I like, that have outlets, that have good lighting, have comfortable seats, that kind of thing. And I go to those regularly. I don't have to worry about it. So really, when you get into each class, know that class. Take stock of like how familiar the material is to you. Again, this is going to affect how you study for it, right? If you don't know it, it's probably going to be better to study in groups or study with somebody. And that way you guys can make sure like everyone's on the same level. You'll feel more confident in the material and as you go through whatever assignments that you have. And of course, how can you apply the information to your ultimate goals? Eventually, after you graduate, you're going to want a job. And you're going to have to start thinking about what from those classes can really be applied to the next level. So thinking about that and taking notes of that in real time is not only going to help you be able to stay focused on the material, but it's going to benefit you when you matriculate. And then 3, understanding the expectations and the professor. If in grad school, I think I'm going to say professors don't matter in undergrad, but they matter more, right? You're going to really want to develop those relationships with them a bit more. Go to office hours. Those are the people that are going to be writing your letters of recommendation. And they're going to give you tips on how to get through the class, the things that you really need to know when you just spend that extra personal time with them. And then, of course, be aware of your resources. There's a ton of things available here, but no one is necessarily going to hold your hand to them, right? So if you think like, hey, I don't necessarily know if I need it, but it might be good for me, it might put me at that next level, go check it out at least. Jennifer and Lindsay, they have access to all kinds of information. You can always ask them. So just make sure you take advantage. I think you just want to get your money's worth, right? You're in here, you're paying money to get this degree, like milk it for all of its worth, basically. Okay. And all of this is to say, I know we're talking about study skills and how does this relate, right? And I think it just helps you stay focused and not get like bogged down. I think keeping that self-awareness really helps, not get frustrated at any point. And so know thy program. It's really good to, if you can, plan out like your 2 years, where your elective's going to be. If you know some of your required courses are definitely going to be harder for you, how are you going to put classes that balance that out in the same quarter, right? So thinking about that to just make sure that you have more time when you're studying and more flexibility, more cushion. Again, the culture of the program is very independent. So like I said earlier, no one's going to necessarily hold your hand. It's the next level. So you should be seeking out the resources, seeking out the information, and then, of course, again, the faculty that you ride with, developing those relationships is really, really important. And I just want to say, like, for me, graduate school was easier than undergrad. And it's because I think the classes, they overlap, right? The subject matters, and you're going to see it. It's going to be reinforced in multiple classes. So you can really take advantage of that and knowing that those subject matters should overlap, right? And so that's... And I don't know, do you guys have anything to add to that? Yeah, or anything that I said just now?
I mean, it was perfect. Maybe I'll give my own example of the whole Know Thy program thing. When I did my MPH, the program director really encouraged us to sort of do this taking stock, and didn't really understand the relevance of it at the time, but it turns out that a lot of people in that MPH program, after they left, kind of were like, well, what now? I have an MPH, but it's a very well-rounded degree, and you get exposed to a lot of different things in public health. But if it's not the same as you come out as an engineer or you come out as a biostatistician. You come out with an MPH in community health science, and you know a lot about community health science, but that can be a sort of disorienting experience if you don't do this sort of exercise in the beginning to say, well, what do I want out of it? And let me craft my courses and my experiences in that way. I'm coming into it and I have global health experience, but I've never actually worked in a community health center or really known that much about community building and advocacy. So that's what I want to learn while I'm here. And not that your experience would really be all that different in content necessarily, it might be, but that you feel different about it after, that you feel that you had tailored this experience and that you had crafted it so that you have expertise in a particular area. So, yeah, it was good advice, and it now resonates with me more than it did at the time.
Right.
So
it's always that way, too.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to turn it over to Jenna to talk about techniques.
Yeah, please jump in, both of you, if I forget something or if you have something to add. Right, so in the context of everything that Danielle said, grad school being very different than undergrad, part of what you, and I agree that it's easier and funner and better, but part of what you have to do is develop your own opinion about the things that you're reading and taking in. So in undergrad, there's a focus on receiving knowledge and, understanding it and thinking about it critically and then presenting it back to show that you've done that. But in grad school, it's really important to have your own take on things, to be able to compare and contrast and decide what of this is valuable to you and what of it, you don't resonate so much with. And so that part of it makes it a very personal exercise and a very fun experience. And as a result, some of the things that you might want to do while you're going through this process are a little bit different than the strategies you had in undergrad, or maybe they're the same, but you take a different spin on them. So study groups, the research shows that people who join study groups actually do better in their programs, and that's been our experience too. We all had a study group when we were doing our comprehensive exam, and yeah, it was really good. And everybody has their own struggle with it. Sometimes and I think Evan will talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes, but, sometimes you feel like you're not keeping up, or sometimes you feel like you're holding the group back or something. But I remember learning different things about the material when we talked about it together than I was when I was reading on my own. So in terms of the advice for study groups, generally keep it small. I would say like 4 to 5, 6 people is kind of optimal. If you have like 12, it's hard for everybody to participate in a meaningful way, which is point number 3. You really get a lot out of study groups when you're active in them, more so than when you just are there. Learning doesn't happen so much by osmosis. And then, so include people who are at different skill levels. Teaching is one of the best ways to learn, and also having your colleagues explain things in different ways sometimes makes the material hit in a different way than when you read it or when your professors explain it to you. So don't be afraid to include people who, have different interests or aren't coming in with the same background as you. Be smart about reading. So you'll also notice that there is much more reading in grad school than there was in undergrad. And it's also, I found it much more interesting, but the volume can be overwhelming at first. And our advice here is that you have to figure out what works for you and what works for the class that you're taking. But in general, people who try to read it all, and I had this strategy in undergrad where I would read through an article and then I would read it again, or a textbook or whatever, and I would highlight and take notes on it, and then I would go back studying for a test and read my notes. And that's not a bad strategy, but I didn't anyway have time in grad school to read things line by line 3 times. So I found personally for me to go through and quickly speed read all of my readings, and then, again, this is part of the tailoring thing, figure out what readings are most applicable to you and which ones are foundational to the course and spend more time on those. And you want to skim through all the material at a minimum and make sure that you responsibly know everything that you're supposed to know. But you might not find that you have enough time to go through line by line multiple times on each reading, and that's okay, in my opinion. So do your best, read whatever you can, but make sure that you're reading smart and making the best use of your time, because you don't want to spend all of your time reading always.
I think that's it's sort of another way to build your critical thinking skills, right? It forces you to go through an article and pick out the pieces that are the most relevant to what it is that you're supposed to be learning, to what it is that you want to learn. And so by learning to study smarter, you're also learning to think better about the things that you're supposed to know. So doing this will help you on exams, this will help you throughout the whole program.
And I think one thing that's good, well, a lot of the articles that you'll have are structured a certain way, and you'll start to learn what that structure is, right? It starts with your abstract, so you get the summary of everything right there. But there's going to be details like the methods part, which is usually the more difficult part, but it lets you know whether or not the study is invalidated, basically, when you critically think about what they're talking about. And then the discussion part, too, right? That's the results. The results are stated in the abstract, but the discussion is when they talk about the more critical thinking of the results. So those are sections that I tend to really focus more of my energy on, because they might be a little bit more difficult for me. Did you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering, because I'm in a PhD program right now too,
Okay.
and so I've had to learn to do this because there's just no possible way. But it is kind of difficult. I feel like to make yourself start to selective read and skim, if you are like me and just feel this kind of inner, but what if I miss something kind of thing. But it's something that I've had to get over. But I'm wondering, one thing that I've tried before is timing myself, like for certain articles, like putting it on my phone and saying I'm only going to give this an hour or whatever, depending on how long it is. But then I find just in the morning I start snoozing. I'm like, but I'm almost done. Right. I'm in the middle of the discussion, And I was wondering just if y'all, in pairing kind of reading with time management, if you had any specific things to say about that. Have you timed yourself before? Do you think that's helpful, or?
I've never timed myself before. Beyond that, I don't know if you guys timed yourself before.
I remember in first year, I just didn't have enough time to do the readings, and that's when we were taking more of our classes. And so I was like, okay, I have 2 hours tonight, I have 4 readings, let's make it happen. So I didn't time it necessarily per article, but I was like, I got to go to bed.
Yeah.
we got to get through this, Jenna, let's go. And I think part of it's tricky. And I think part of it is being okay with not knowing everything sometimes. And that's uncomfortable for us, and especially when you're used to undergrad where every single word that's presented to you is testable. At the graduate level, that's true, but most of the theoretical stuff and the stuff where you're going to need to know really, really what's in the readings, usually you're going to have a take-home exam. So it's you don't have to worry so much about missing one thing in the results that's going to, you'll have a class discussion about it, and then maybe somebody else will bring up something that you might have missed on your first read through. And it's the crazy thing about academia is you'll never know everything about a topic. And that's just a very difficult thing to come to terms with. But being vulnerable and letting your peers help you with that knowledge and letting professors help you to know what you should know and be humble about what you don't know. And I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for that, but I think it's, I think it's always a challenge, and every person sort of has to develop their own balance of what they're comfortable with knowing in more detail and knowing in less detail.
Yeah, but to your point, I have timing issues too, and so I probably should try this, but I do think that the timing can be helpful, if nothing else, to help you. Okay, you only have an hour to look at your article. Well, that forces you to figure out what you need to pick out from that article. So if you're studying for an FE class, well, you probably really need to know about the methods, and you know if the study is designed well. And maybe the discussion, if you have to skim over that, isn't as important because it's really about the methods, right? if you only have an hour and you're talking about like a CHS class and you really want to sort of understand the theory and the concepts, maybe spend more time on like the introduction and the discussion. So the hour, or the timing might sort of help you figure out how to like sort of force it in the time that you only have. So I think that there's totally potential like use to doing that. Not that we haven't necessarily tried it exactly that way, but I do think there's use to trying that.
Yeah.
Quick question about reading. I was wondering if you guys tend to read like any additional articles on your computer, or if you print them out and like make notes, because that's what I would do during undergrad. But I was looking at some of like my syllabi, and there's just like a lot of additional articles. So I'm not sure if that will be feasible, but I wondered if you guys did that, or if you have other classmates who did that.
I mean, that's a good point. So often there's like required articles and then additional articles. And I mean, the additional ones are great because you can choose what's relevant to your interests. If you're interested in maternal and child health, pick out the ones about that. Printing them all out, I think it depends on your learning style and whether or not, I don't know. I think like last year, Professor Anna Essential was saying that there's like a different part of your brain that is activated when you write things out versus when you read them. So she's a fan of printing and writing, and whatever works for you. But there is a lot, and you're gonna you have 200 pages of free printing per quarter at the Writing Center, so you can.
Not very much. That's like a
Yeah.
week. So,
Yeah.
so I am a printer and a writer, and so I really like coming into this prep, and I did that through my master's. But coming here is like, okay, I don't want thousands of pages that I have nothing to do with at the end of a quarter. Not thousands, but lots of paper. And
Thousands. Probably.
And so what I did is I found an app on my iPad, and I was like, okay, this isn't quite the same, but it allowed me to sort of like have a PDF of like every article on my iPad in one app that's one thing this big, and there was a highlight function, and it wasn't as pretty, and I couldn't like write as like legibly with my fingers like I could with a pen, but like I sort of forced myself to think in that way, and sort of being able to write and highlight gave me the piece that I felt like I was missing. So everyone has their own strategy. Some people really prefer writing, like printing and writing. Some people are totally fine reading on a screen. Just find what works for you, and that worked for me. So just testing that.
I use Evernote too. I used Evernote for a while. I don't use it anymore, but it is. It's an app. It's free. Of course, there's always the upgraded version, but it's like a notebook. It's like a notebook on your desktop, right? But you can pull articles in there too. So it's like you can write. It's like you could write notes next to the article and highlight it and all that kind of stuff. So that can be, save the trees type of thing.
Yeah, we should have said at the beginning, please feel free to ask questions. That's what we want. So, yeah, thank you for asking those great questions. Okay, so, I think this one got cut off, but we'll get to it eventually. So procrastination is tricky, and it's something I think that most people struggle with. The strategies that we have to suggest around that are first prioritization. So I am a really big fan of to-do lists, and I will make a to-do list for myself, but I was realizing eventually that like dusting the shelves and preparing for my comprehensive exam are not the same value on my to-do list. Like they both should get done, but actually one of them is way more important than the other. So, and I love checking things off my to-do list. So I would be like, dusted those shelves, mopped the floor, cross. And then at the end of the day, I have a really clean apartment and I have not prepared for my comprehensive exam. So prioritizing your tasks is really important. Don't just make one list with everything you need to do, but decide which ones to do first so that if you run out of time, you've done the most important ones first. And I, as I was saying, often avoid the things that I don't want to do by doing other things first that still make me feel productive. And I read this book about getting things done, and it said you have to do the difficult things first. Different things work for everybody, but that book was suggesting you're going to spend mental energy thinking about the things that you're not doing, that you're anxious because you're not doing it, and so you end up spending so much more time and ruining your other tasks and not being present on them because you're worried about this big thing that you're not doing and you're avoiding. And then, so to that point, I just want to talk about the difference briefly between time management and procrastination. So time management is about fitting things into a tight schedule, time and tasks, and procrastination is an emotional thing. It's about waiting too long because you're afraid of something, or you're not confident about something, or you're uncomfortable and you don't want to do it because it is uncomfortable, and so you leave it too long. And they're very different, and you need different strategies to manage each of them. So with time management, things like apps and some of the things that we've been talking about work really well. With procrastination, you have to get over that emotional barrier of, I don't want to write this paper because I feel like I don't know enough, and you just have to write it. You just have to be like, but I do know enough, and that's what I'm here for, and I need to start on writing it. So recognize those feelings, the emotional ones and also the practical time-based ones, and try to deal with whichever ones you're dealing with at the time. Another strategy is to not try to finish everything at once and break things up into more manageable small chunks. That will help it feel less overwhelming. And it truly is not that big of a deal. These things, you're here to learn and grow, and grad school is awesome, but no one thing that you do here is going to be make or break. And so don't overvalue small particular things, because that can make you more anxious and can make you more into the procrastination realm, can make you not want to do what you should be doing. And at the end of the day, just doing it, just getting moving on it makes a big difference. And then there's also, so this is the part that got cut off, there's time management and study resources. So apps like 30/30, that's like a timing app where you can schedule in your day and it will count down from 30 minutes, or you can make it however long you want. And so for some people it's helpful because it reminds them to take a break every 30 minutes, just for 2 to 5 minutes to stretch or to get up or something like that. For other people it helps because it keeps them focused for 30 minutes when otherwise they would be taking breaks constantly. Whatever. A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. There's Study Room, Self-Control, Study Buddy. So these are all distraction apps and apps that will help with your studying if you feel like you need them. And I think these slides are available for you after the presentation, so don't feel like you need to write everything down. Danielle briefly mentioned Evernote. I really like it too for note-taking and for annotating. And also Trello, it's like an electronic bulletin board. It's really good for group collaboration and for managing your tasks, and I like Trello too. I kind of do want to change the color scheme to improve performance, but I'm afraid of what that's going to... Yeah. Okay, I think this is my last slide of tips, and then on to Evan. And this one's not cut off, so back to presentation view we go. So you're going to hear a lot of advice from people like us and others who have had their own experiences in the program, and you should take everything with a grain of salt. Create your own experience, and sometimes people are like, oh, 211. It's like, well, 211 is hard for some people and really easy for others, and it's I think it's important to make the experience your own and not come in with too many expectations that other people create for you. Evan, I think, is going to go over this again, but sometimes you'll read a question or think about an assignment, get the idea in your head, and then start going off on it, and go in this direction, and then a month later you end up with something that's not actually what the assignment was about, or not really where. And so you have this final product that you've been working on for a month, and then you go back to the syllabus and you're like, oh no. So I would advise you to look at the expectations in the class continuously, and to it's obvious, but it's the kind of thing that you can lose sight of really easily. And I think that's an important tip in general in grad school, to keep in mind what the expectations are and make sure that you're on a path that will deliver something related to that expectation, hopefully highly related. Manage your stress and the available resources. So a big part of being successful is also being okay with your experience and not getting too overwhelmed and stressed. So there are resources like the counseling services here at UCLA. They have like a meditation group, and there's a lot of events and fun stuff, and don't be afraid to spend some of your time doing that and self-care. And there's the writing center too. They're helpful. They're not magicians. They can't make your writing perfect if it's terrible to start with, but speaking from my own experience, my writing has gotten better over the years, but I did take them a pretty bad first product, and they helped me work on it. But yeah, related to the Writing Center and the available resources, I was getting really stressed because I had made this Writing Center appointment and I didn't feel like I had a good enough product to show them. And I found that, writing is a kind of iterative process, right? It's, you should write even though you don't feel like you're ready to write, and get help on your writing even though you don't feel like it's the perfect version or the best version that it can be, and that's okay. Like, you don't have to show them the best version. And so I ended up keeping the appointment and going to the writing center, like even with my half-done product, and they were still really helpful. And then I went back again with another version, and that's it, right? It's not like you're going to produce this magnum opus all of a sudden that's beautiful and perfect. It's like it's an iterative process, and you keep at it. So don't get too stressed. And then lastly, manage your load in terms of the extracurriculars you participate in, and maybe take this first semester quarter as a time to just figure out how the workload is going to be for you. And you might want to hold off on getting too involved in things or taking on additional responsibilities like work until you know what it's going to be like and what you can fit in.
I just wanted to say one real quick thing about the stress piece. I think that also if, like life, like there's also life, right? You're in school, but there's also life. And things happen, right? And they may interfere with what the expectations are, due dates of your assignments or exams. Talk to your professors about it. Like, don't be afraid to ask. Like, the worst that's going to happen is they're going to say, we can't accommodate your request. But it's worthwhile if you have something going on in your life. Like I said, everybody wants you to win. So if you have something going on in your life that is just really inhibiting you from finishing an assignment on time, or even being able to focus, or even take the test, who knows what can happen. You really feel like you can go and talk to, your professor or the TA or whomever about what you need and what can happen for you. So I just wanted to say that, to not put more stress on yourself in those types of situations.
Oh, that's really good advice, yeah.
Yeah, that's something I actually really struggled with at first. I was always sort of nervous to talk to professors, and then I don't know, I had this epiphany one day. I was like, this is their job. Like, they have to help me if I go to them. Sort of realizing that is really helpful, right? So, like, if you have a problem or you want to talk through something, or if like you really have no idea what you're doing on a particular paper, and you want someone to help, with the paper, make an appointment and go talk to them. They might be very helpful. So, try it out.
I think it's your turn, Evan.
Okay, so we said that undergrad is very different than grad school. Undergrad is not all about it, but it's sort of a weeding out process, and you can get very good at like memorizing a lot of information, regurgitating it on a test, and then forgetting it 2 weeks later. And grad school is very different, right? It's all about critical thinking and learning to think really intelligently about a complex problem. There's not always a right answer. There's not always a best answer, but it's coming up. It's showing that you can think through a problem critically. So just knowing that, I think, is really helpful. Knowing that you've already made it here, you've already made it through the weeding out process, I think is really helpful. You're already smart, and everyone already expects that you're smart, and so there's no need to sort of like get really antsy about like trying to get an A. I mean, everyone can get an A. There's no like bell curve, I guess, is sort of what one wants to say. That said, there are exams or ways of testing you, and so these are just some tips that we've found helpful. Feel free to add in your own tips. Everyone has their own way of taking and approaching the exams. So when it comes to exams, there are different types of exams. There are written exams. You won't actually have a whole bunch of those, but you might maybe in like an epidemiology or biostats class, where you do sort of learn a bunch of information, go regurgitate it on paper, and hopefully not forget it 2 weeks later. But like particularly in CHS, if you have exams, they're probably take-home exams, and that's a very different style and different way of thinking, a different way of approaching answering those questions. And so we'll talk through a couple of those ways of doing that. Also papers. I'd say probably half of your papers, particularly here in CHS, or half of your sort of exams are actually a term paper. And so learning to think through, tackling the 12 to 15 page paper and turning it in and feeling really good about it, or hopefully feeling good about it at the end is we have a couple of tips for that as well. And then particularly with 211, you'll find that there is a lot of group work in public health. This is an inherently sort of group work oriented field, and so we have some tips for getting through the group work portions of the program as well. So when it comes to just sort of standard regular exams, these are things that I find very helpful. I tend to be really anxious about exams. Exams are inherently anxiety provoking, right? And so do what you can to reduce anxiety. Don't cram the night before. That's actually really not that helpful, particularly here, because you're not memorizing information and studying that on paper. It's about critical thinking. And so if you can do things to reduce your anxiety, maybe study, everyone always says this, but study not the night before, but study beforehand, and get a good night's sleep the night before. That'll help you think clearer. That'll help you, sort of answer questions better. And the types of questions that we're asking here. Don't do what I did today. Don't show up late, because that's really anxiety provoking, right? And so you're running to the exam and then you're flustered. So, I'm still working on that one, but that's, a way to reduce anxiety. Also, you don't have to know everything to do well. And I think, Jen and Danielle talked about that. If a 90% is an A, that means you can miss 1 out of 10 questions and still get an A. It's like, so just knowing that you don't need to know every little detail in order to do well, I think is really helpful. Different questions are worth different amounts, so maybe pay attention. Like if you're spending way too long on a question that's only worth a couple of points, maybe guess and move on. Go to a question that's worth a lot more time and can get you a lot more credit. Again, I find this helpful because I'm a slow test taker. Plan to finish early. So when I first get a piece of paper at a desk and I have to answer an exam in an hour, well, okay, look and see, okay, I've got maybe 20 questions and I've got an hour to do it. So what is the math? That gives me 3 minutes-ish per question. And so just sort of, right? So knowing, okay, I got 3 minutes per question, that helps you sort of, frame how you're going to approach a question. You don't have all that much time to think about it. There's no, they're not necessarily expecting a masterpiece because of that. And then anticipate the answer. So you probably know the answer. You read the question. If it's a multiple choice question, maybe try to know what the answer is before you look at the question. That'll help you easily pick the right one. If it's an essay question, sort of think through the question before you immediately begin writing, and that might help you kind of formulate a concise and sort of meaningful answer to that question. Okay, so there are different types of questions I talked about a little bit, but one thing I want to reiterate that we talked about is read the instructions before and after you answer the question. I think that's really important. This is something that I kind of do all the time. I go off on a tangent and then I realize I didn't actually answer the question. Or there's a piece of it that I didn't answer, or there was a thing that I didn't quite talk about in detail enough. And so reading the instructions before, but then after, helps you to really sort of make sure you get everything you need on the paper that you can get credit for and then move on with. I heard this one from Dr. Innocence herself, circle the verb. I think a lot of people find that really helpful. So, and what we mean by that is, if you have, a question that says define X, well, all you have to do is define it. You don't have to say everything you know about it. You don't have to give a summary of what it means and its relevance to X, Y, and Z. Just define it. That's all you're going to get credit for in the end anyway, so just do it and move on and, use your time wisely. If you do have to summarize or you have to, describe or explain, that involves a little bit more thought. This is sort of one of the few times where writing style isn't necessarily so important, like in person, on a test. The professors know that this is a timed thing, so you don't have to have a masterpiece. They're not expecting Shakespeare. Just make sure you write legibly and clearly and answer the question and move on and get your credit and move on. These are some things I've also heard directly from Carol and Essential as, your first impression is usually right. If you're really struggling or you're low on time, go with your first answer or go with your first instinct. That's probably the right one. And apparently, true sounding false questions are hard to make. So if you really don't know the answer to something, here's just one tip, pick true, because apparently more times than not, it's true. Don't use that as your way to answer, but just if you're really low on time, I heard that one directly from Dr. Innocence. Okay, so the meat of, again, what you're going to do here is actually writing papers. And I think that a lot of people, like myself included, get writer's block. And I get writer's block basically every time I write a paper, and I have to sort of go through this process. And you have 12, 15 pages, and you have to write these really intelligent thoughts about this topic that's this big amorphous thing. And you've got this blank page staring at you, and it's really intimidating. And so my advice is really just start writing. It doesn't have to be pretty. No one else is going to see it. Just start. So like a quick example, I do LGBT stress and so if I were writing a paper on discrimination and health, well, okay, where do I start? Okay, well, discrimination is usually bad for health. There's a really ugly first sentence. I've got something on paper, and I can go back and fix that later, but discrimination is bad for health, right? And I know I read that some places, so I find a couple of I know a couple of articles, and I can put those in there, and okay, it's all there, I come back and make it sound better, but it's there, and oh my god, I've started, right? I know, maybe there are differences by, I don't know, gender or race, and I think I read something about that somewhere, so I can write differences by gender and race, and now there's something else on the paper, and that's really exciting. And so before you know it, you've got this really ugly, but this really ugly 1 or 2 page sort of outline or sort of blurb of thoughts, and now you have something to work from and something to fix, and it's not this blank page. You've got everything there that can now be fixed, and that's a lot easier than not having anything at all. So just start. So this is very much the ideal. I would say a good paper maybe takes 2 weeks to write. Again, this is the ideal. Not everyone always has 2 weeks. But again, so just start writing. You start on day one. Start writing. I have to write about discrimination in health, and okay, write everything I know off the top of my head, and maybe the papers that I know are relevant to that. And it's all on paper. Okay, great, that's day one. Well, maybe day two, I know, okay, maybe I look up more articles, and I want to look into specific kinds of discrimination or specific kinds of health outcomes, right? And I'm reading lots of papers, and I find lots of really interesting tidbits that I think are really interesting to me, but they're all in 15 different papers on my desktop, and it's really overwhelming. Well, maybe now what I usually do is I copy and paste chunks of text that I really like, and I stick them in a document. And now it's all there, and again, something that I can fix. And before you know it, you have 15 pages, and again, they're really ugly, but you have this really sort of ugly working document that you can work from. And that might take a couple of days. I would say then take a break, go do something else. You probably have another paper to work on, do something else, right? Come back to it after a day or two, and then, okay, now you've got this really ugly document, but you can turn it into a draft. The bones are all there, and it's just up to you to now fix something instead of come up with something brand new. And your first draft might take a couple of days because the first draft was really ugly. I don't know, but and then take breaks in between each of these drafts, and eventually you end up with something that's oh my gosh, I just read this whole thing, and it sounds kind of really smart, and I didn't even know I knew all these things, and I didn't make major corrections. I think maybe I'm done. I think on your last day though, reread the instructions. I've done this a lot. If there's a particular prompt or a particular thing that you needed to address, and inevitably I find I didn't really address this part very much, or I only sort of said a sentence about it. This is your chance to go back and okay, add a paragraph about whatever the prompt asks you to do. And then, you're done. So, you have maybe 9 days worth of work over, 14 or 15 days, and that's the ideal. That said, for instance, your comprehensive exams, I think you can get a weekend to do it. So that's not always, the way, that it works, and, I know I, 75% of the time don't actually spend 2 weeks on a paper because I procrastinated. But, so, what can you do to manage your time and to make sure that you still put out a good product, in 1 week or something? Well, again, we sort of talked about this. Know sort of yourself. Find your rhythm. Are you a morning person? Are you a night person? I always say, my brain turns off when the sun goes down. I'm not a night person at all. And so I wake up a little early, and I'm very much a coffee shop person. I go to my coffee shop, and it's great, and I've got my coffee, and I feel good. And so I find my rhythm, and I'm really productive for small chunks of time, and it helps me sort of get a product out in less than 2 weeks if I absolutely need to. And then, we sort of talked about this. Do you really need the internet? Sometimes you do. You're looking for papers, you're looking for ideas, you're making your first ugly document. But then, once you're sort of working on your drafts, you maybe not need the internet. I tend to get distracted. So I intentionally go to my particular coffee shop because the internet's really shoddy. So I know that I don't even have the option of looking at the internet there, right? And so just sort of knowing yourself, knowing what your weaknesses are. Is it surfing the web? Is it, whatever? And making sure that you put yourself in a situation to really spend time thinking critically about your paper and work on your paper. I think those are some tips for when you don't actually have those 2 weeks. You're going to have so in between those drafts, right, you're going to have random ideas that pop into your head, and my partner thinks I'm insane. I've got a notepad next to the bed, and I'll sit up in the middle of the night, and I've got this idea, and I write it down, but now it's on paper, and I can go back to this later when I'm thinking clearly, and I can go back to bed and sleep, and I'm not really anxious. So I have notepads all over the place, and I look weird. But your ideas come to you at really weird times. I mean, that's like, it's very much like a biological thing, right? Like when you're not thinking about, the paper specifically, your brain is like processing and thinking. And so you're going to have ideas all over the place. Just be prepared for that. If you need, write on your phone or whatever, you're going to have a list of ideas that can now then be pulled into your ugly document and worked into the paper. So I find making it easy to take random notes at random times really helpful. Okay, so finally, group projects. There's going to be a big group project in 211, and potentially in other classes as well. We think that it's probably really interesting. It's probably really helpful to establish expectations up front with each other. These are people that you're going to be working with long term. It's best not to be like, the night before the project is due, and like there are major pieces of that aren't done, and you're not communicating with this person very well, and you haven't heard from this person. So establishing like, okay, we're going to meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays after EPI and work on our project, and this is now the built-in time, and this is the time, and and then like so-and-so is going to come and have done this piece, and so is going to come and have done this piece, helps sort of just make all of this run a lot smoother. And then we sort of joke when we say this, but like, don't be that person. There's always sort of like that person in the group, right? And and then that person can actually be different people. That can be someone who doesn't necessarily contribute enough. That can be someone who maybe is a little overbearing and contributes too much. Just recognizing, right? Recognizing that really when it comes, like, yes, you're going to spend a lot of time working on like your 211 project, in like 6 months-ish actually, but in the end, it's a class project. So like, do you really, like, don't sweat the small details. Do you really care if like the project is about, this topic or this? I mean, if you do, then fine, voice your opinion. But if it helps with group cohesion to all sort of get along and just put a product, on the table that will get you credit and to move on like happily from 211, do that. Anything to add?
Yeah, we had, I asked a recent graduate from the master's program if she had any tips about 211, because none of us took 211, so we can't speak about our direct experience from it. And she gave me some pointers for you guys. So, if there is any 211 hoopla, she said stop it if it still exists. It was an urban legend for her cohort, and that everyone feared, but she hopes it's like over and done with. So it doesn't make any sense if there is any. I don't know, what previous cohorts have said, but she said, if there is any hoopla, stop it. And then she said, take time to get to know people in 210 so that no matter who's in your 211 group, you'll feel some familiarity. So just be like, have a more like camaraderie among your cohort, get to know each other. So it won't really matter, no matter who's in your group. When you do get into your groups in 211, the first thing you should do is establish a regular meeting time for the quarter. She's like, this is the number one thing, because if you don't do it that first time, apparently maybe they had a lot of trouble like figuring out a consistent time to meet. And then it can start to feel like everything is a competition, but don't let that be the case again. There's no need to compete within your group or between groups. Everyone can get an A. So that everyone can do well. And it's more likely when everyone supports each other. So those were her tips for 211.
Yeah, I mean, we're all here to learn and to grow, and just use each other wisely. I mean, like this can actually be a really good experience. 211. Yeah.
What are we learning in 211? Because I've heard a lot of tips of like how to not get wrapped up in the like 211 thing, but I'm like, what is 211?
Yeah, so they say that 211 is sort of like the bread and butter of this program. I think in the first quarter, in a group, you come up with like a public health intervention, and so like you get to, it's exciting. You get to come up with an idea and like kind of come up with a way to fix a social problem, and then so you develop this whole proposal for that, and then in quarter 2, you're developing like an evaluation plan. So it's sort of like, you haven't actually done it, but it's like you're developing a plan for like, okay, now that, once this goes into the field, like how do we test it to make sure that it actually, like, how do we know if it worked or not? So you develop sort of a plan for testing that. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently there's not a lot of people, so that's good. I think it's just probably you're spending 2 quarters with the same group all that time, so it's like maybe a little bit more intense than other classes that you'll have for just 10 weeks, right?
All right. So we all did take CHS 210, which you're all about to start, and so we actually have examples from our exams, just so you can sort of see example questions from the exam and sort of know what to expect.
mean, so the first thing we wanted to talk about was instructions. A lot of people actually failed the exam because they didn't read the instructions, not because they didn't know what, was going on in 210. They were really smart people, but they just didn't read the instructions. And in some cases, most cases, the instructions are there because your instructor wants you to follow them, and not doing so will irritate them and potentially cause you to lose a lot of marks. In some cases, enough to fail the take-home exam, and in some cases, enough to fail the course. So, not to scare you, but just to show you what it's really easy. That's like, this should be very empowering. It's like all you got to do is follow the instructions. So, due by midnight, not 12:01, send it early. These are real, everything we're going to show you is real questions, real instructions, whatever. Real typos. So make sure you send it to the right email address, even though your professor's email address is different. He wanted it sent to that one. People who sent it to the other one didn't get their exam graded. Make sure you're using a format that they can use. Name the file properly, the way they want it to be named. We cut off some of the instructions. We're not going to show you all of them because that's just unnecessary. But they want the student ID on every page, but not your name. Double space, 12-point font. So there are instructions like this on most of the documents that you produce, and following them is an easy way to impress people and not make a bad impression before they've even read anything that you've written. There's lots of particulars here about how you should cite and how you should ask questions and when you can't ask any more questions. Okay, now we're going to go through some actual questions. So this is from the 210 class that we took in fall 2013, and there were 5-point, 10-point, and 20-point questions. This is just an example of what the questions look like and how you might go about answering them. So this is a 5-point question, and it said on the exam, 5-point questions can be answered in a quarter page or less double space. That's really short. So here they're saying, don't stress out, don't provide too much information, don't dump everything you know on the page because that makes you look dumber. It's way better to provide a succinct answer that's to the point and, doesn't regurgitate everything you know about the topic because that's unnecessary and not what they're asking for. And in the CHS 210 exam, there's a page limit. So don't spend your time on the easy questions, writing everything you know because you're worried you're going to miss something. Just clear, succinct answer and move on with it. So this question, what is the difference between mediation and moderation? We had the words highlighted, but they didn't show up in this version. So difference, that's a word you want to pay attention to, right? So in order to write what is the difference between mediation and moderation, you have to say what is mediation, what is moderation, and what is the gap, what is the difference, what is not in one that is in the other, right? You can't just define them both. You do have to say actually what is the difference. And then provide a public health example to clarify your points. So provide, that's another word that you might want to circle, right? Not explain, not analyze, not summarize, provide. Simple, right? So you've now told me what the difference between mediation and moderation is. Just give me a quick example of what that looks like in public health. It doesn't need to restate everything you said previously. It just needs to be relevant and there. Basically, it needs to be provided on the page. And mine actually didn't take it. It was short. I think mine was 2 or 3 sentences max. So,
and I'll say I didn't follow the instructions. I gave the whole thing, and I was like, oh my god, I know so much about this topic. And then my 5-point question was a page. I always did a page I forget it was a 20-page or whatever. I always did a page of that exam answering this question, which gave me a lot less room for everything else. Right, so and I got the credit because I answered in the first couple of lines what they wanted, but then the rest of the page was a waste, right? So just recognize that all you had to do was put a couple of lines down, and she got the same credit I did.
Yeah, and this exam in particular, they had multiple questions you could choose from. So answer 3 of 5, and then the next section answer 4 of 5, and things like that. To the point of, maybe not needing to read every single line or not getting anxious if you don't know as much about one reading as another. CHS 210 provides you the option to choose what you're going to answer. I think
I just
Oh,
want
yeah.
to say that is an excellent example because I have totally found myself in a position like you. Like I just I know so much about this, so I'm going to brain dump. And then I'm looking at the paper that my peer wrote, and he wrote like half of it. And I'm like, how did we get the same grade? Thinking like, this is an injustice.
Yeah.
But it's because they answered the question. So I love that example. It's kind of like, thank you. So that I don't brain dump on the paper because I constantly have to like fight that urge.
Mm-hmm.
I also think I didn't understand that there was a difference between provide and explain, and it's kind of blowing my mind.
Just those simple words. I'm like, oh my god.
And so I just want to reiterate some of the things about the instructions. To me, the most frustrating thing is getting docked for like not reading well. And I get like so mad at myself. So whenever I do something like a take-home exam, I format my entire paper first. Like I'll put the page numbers on it, I'll put my student ID up there, I'll look through the 3 of 5, all the questions, choose my questions, put them where they should be on the page. So if the 5-point question is a half a page, I'll put the 5-point question, one of them at the top, one of them in the middle. And then the next one, 10-point can be a page or less, that will get its own page. And just put the question at the top. Just so I can have and know that I followed the simple stuff first. And then, so this was a 10-point question, and it's got multiple pieces to it. And the highlighting showed up somehow on this one.
Yeah,
but-
you must have bolded yours. It's so smart.
So I highlighted a bunch of things of words that stood out for me. So what I do with this question is, again, this isn't a creative writing class, right? I want to answer what it's asking for. So I start bullet pointing, okay? I need to, what is basically defining, right? So I need to define open society. I need to, how are, that is, you have to kind of do some interpretation here. That's more explaining. I have to explain something when they're saying, and how are. So I'm like, okay, now I need to, bullet point number 2, explain this. And then to what extent? So how far does something go or not go? I should have bolded that word too. So I'm not just bolding here the verbs. I really pay attention also to these like little qualifiers, right? Like the design of health interventions, not necessarily the outcomes. This is how we're creating health interventions. So let me go through it line by line. So what is open society and how are Niswander, I never pronounce her name right, the thoughts applicable to the design of health interventions? So I know for that question, I'm going to need to define open society and talk about how health interventions are created, right? And link her thoughts to how they're created. Again, not how health interventions improve population health, not how open society was developed in the beginning, not anything like all you know about maybe this particular article. Then the second part of the question is to what extent do the principles of the open society relate to CBPR? Does anyone know what CBPR is?
Community-based participatory research.
Absolutely. And so this is a take-home exam. You'll have all these readings. So community-based participatory research is basically really involving the community in designing and conducting research. So they're asking what about an open society relates to that? How far does it go, though? So to what extent does it apply or does it not apply is basically what they're saying. And so then does anyone have questions about that part? And then provide 3 arguments for or against this claim. Or is such a, it's an important word as well. For this, I would just interpret, I could choose 3 arguments, 2 of them could be for, 1 could be against, or you could choose all 3 for, all 3 against. You would seem to have an option with this part of the question, but if you feel like it's not clear, ask, right? And then here again, to what extent do the ideas of an open society resonate or not resonate with your own public health interests? Now, I think this last part of this question is interesting because it's subjective, right? It's about you and your thoughts. You're not going to be graded on your thoughts, okay? Because it's not going to be consistent. But you're going to be graded on whether or not you provided your thoughts, right? They just want to know, does it resonate or not resonate with your... You don't have to, go into some elaborate thing about your own public health interests, and it doesn't have to be like the core of this question at all, because it's going to be nice. And like, oh, that's nice, but really they're just going to be grading on whether or not you provided that information.
Okay, and so this is an example of like a 20-point, one of the big questions, and I know like you haven't actually read the paper, and I haven't taken the class or read this paper yet, and that's totally fine. I just want to sort of talk through how we might answer the question. So this, they tell you, okay, this question can be answered in about 2 pages or less, and I probably took like 4 because, anyway, but I learned my lesson. So this asks you to briefly summarize the findings, in the article, particularly looking at this figure. And I know you haven't looked at the figure, and this text is too small, but there are a few things that pop out at me, so maybe we can talk through those. Like one is the title. This is the number of post-neonatal infant deaths due to diarrhea and pneumonia by race in Mississippi between 1955 and 1975. So there's basically your first sentence in your response, right? This is the number of, this is what it is. And so you can sort of say what the graph tells you. I also see, look, there are these 2 lines, and they're totally different from each other. There's this one line at the bottom that's basically flat. It's a little bit lower, but it's basically flat. And there's this really sort of drastic line. And this is for white babies, and this is for African American babies. On the y-axis we have the number of, basically the number of deaths, and on the x-axis we have the years of time. So we see basically for white babies, the number of deaths stays, gets a little bit better. We get a little bit better at medicine, over a 20-year span, but it stays about the same. But there's this really drastic drop. Also it starts way higher for African American babies, so there's something wrong there. And so, about halfway through though, there's this big drop, and what does that mean? And you haven't read the paper, and so that's totally fine, but you will, and you will have discussed it. And this 1965, this is when the Civil Rights Act was passed. So now we can pull in that information and say, maybe there we see this drop, and this is totally what the, researchers did. They said, we probably see this drop because of this policy change, and now, African Americans have access to all of, hospitals and all of these services, right? And, we see it get way lower, it's still higher. There's still a difference here at the end, and so there still is a problem, but we do see a big difference. And so we can talk about how, that policy change looks like it made a big difference in addressing this disparity. What is the next part of the question? Okay, so that I overlooked one of the parts, and this is why I would want to go back. What is the rationale for choosing these specific health outcomes? And it doesn't, we can't talk about that now because you haven't read the paper, but they chose diarrhea and pneumonia for a reason, and I frankly actually forget. But, it's in the paper, and just make sure you include that information because you'll get credit for answering that piece of the question for including that. And then also, you need to tie in some theories that you'll talk about. And so, it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to focus on what they are and how they apply now, but you're going to have to sort of, you're going to have to discuss each of those theories, explain the finding, and explain how they pertain to or don't pertain to this graph and the paper overall. So, you have to do that by first briefly discussing each of the theories individually. So you need to devote a chunk of text to talking about what each does and what each says. And then, describe the appropriateness of the theory that you choose. So you have to choose one that best sort of fits these findings. And, I will emphasize there may or may not be a perfect or one best answer here. I looked at my exam and I chose the ecological model on the exam, and I got credit for it. I also think though the fundamental causes theory could apply. So just knowing your theories and knowing sort of what they mean and what they say and being able to apply them to this graph will get you credit. It's not there's not necessarily a one best answer. It's coming up with a well reasoned out thought, and showing your thought process.
Yeah, I used fundamental causes and I still got full marks too.
Yeah.
So that just kind of shows you that in grad school there is no right answer. It's more about knowing the material and how you present it.
And then, okay, the last sentence, be sure to also explain why the other two were not or were less appropriate. So, I think no one probably chose theory of planned behavior because it really doesn't necessarily apply here. So that one's easy to say. This doesn't apply because X, Y, Z. It doesn't, fit these findings, and this is actually what it says. And then, picking the one that you didn't pick, the other one, and saying, well, this one also might apply, but I picked this one because, sort of really showing why you picked the one you picked and why the other ones are less appropriate will get you full marks on this question.
And I realize I might have cut myself off a little bit before, but I find it really helpful, again, to make the bullet points to make sure I've answered every question and then go back and make it prettier, right? Especially during a take-home exam. You've made sure you hit the page limit by just answering what needs to be done, and then go back and, you know, elaborate, put your own little flavor on it or whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
Oh.
So this is a picture of our class right after a big exam, and look, we're all really happy. So we're all very happy we just finished. But so anyway, I mean, thank you for listening. Do you have any questions for any of us, or any thoughts or feedback? Yeah.
To what extent would you say style matters between a take-home exam that you spend more time writing and a rushed in-class written response that would be presumably less elegant?
I would say that there's a big difference there. So the rushed in-class version is not so much about style, it's about making sure you sort of clearly just say the things you need to say and get credit for them. You're sort of forced to think about style on a take-home exam because you have a page limit, right? And so you have to fit all, I had to figure out how to fit everything else into that condensed period, or condensed page limit because I took too long on the other questions. And so style does matter, and you are here, you know, you're in grad school and you're going to eventually go out and write like grant applications and, you know, things that require like writing legibly, and so they are looking to make sure that you can like clearly and intelligently make your case, not necessarily dumping everything you know on the page. So I would say anything you do at home, focus a little bit more on making sure it's at least clear, if not like, you know, the best thing you've ever written. It doesn't have to be the best thing you've ever written, but
But in terms of like style per se, like do you mean like does it have to be like pretty?
Well, so I got an English degree.
Yeah.
And the types of papers I would write were works of art in my mind.
Mm.
It does
You
not
know,
need to be.
It seems very different.
Yeah, I think you will just, what Evan said, that you want to make sure to be just clear and concise and really answer the question. But I also think it's important in these, it matters what class you're talking about, right? So if your class that has TAs, the TAs are going to be grading it, your take home, versus if the professor's going to be grading your take home. It might be a little bit different, right? Because if you're, so like TAs will have to grade to find and make sure that there's certain things there, but not as much for these like maybe little nuances in how nice it sounds or how well it's put together. Just make sure you identified it. Versus in a class where it's just the professor grading it, it's not going to have a bias between multiple TAs, right? So he can kind of use that more in how he looks or grades your paper.
Yeah, I would say that style only matters to the extent that it helps you to make your point. I mean, it does matter, but not that much. Like, as long as you're conveying things clearly and you have, it's more about presenting your case and how you do that. So people have different styles, and you know, if your writing is not distractingly bad, I think there's A's can happen in between like good and amazing writing. And that's my own personal feel about it. But style matters much more on take home than in class. Yeah.
And I just want to reiterate what they're saying too. I think that this comes into being a professional working on papers and manuscripts and stuff too. We all have to follow instructions, and the faculty members are sticklers for instructions. Like they love them, and it makes your job so much easier, which you already talked about. But in terms of the creative writing and the masterpiece that are coming from different backgrounds, don't be shy. And I talk about this all the time. I think be direct. Like they're asking you a question, don't try to make that response. Like don't try to find new words for that response.
Right.
Just say they've asked this question, and just say, like, basically, now I am describing the blah, blah, blah. And that's going to make your life so much easier. The professors are going to be reading it, and they're going to be like, oh, now they're describing and they're going to not wonder what you're trying to talk about. So don't try to be too creative in those ways. Be creative when you're analyzing something, not too creative, but be creative in your thoughtfulness, and be creative in the fact that you're able to apply these things to real life experiences. But don't be afraid to say, like, now I'm going to discuss these things and how they relate to real life experiences.
Right.
That's really okay. And that's what they want to see. They want to see that you can follow the instructions. I mean, I spend a lot of time with faculty members, and I cannot tell you how often they're like, they didn't follow the instructions. And maybe you did, but you just got so excited with making it really different and unique that they can't even tell that you follow the instructions. So don't be afraid to do that. And I think when you start reading your articles, there's a format. These are the methods, and now I'm going to describe them. And just don't, once you read those, start to copy what they do, because there's a format. And everyone follows it.
That's great, yeah.
That's just that.
This is actually a more technical question, but does the department have a writing style guide they prefer, like Chicago or MLA?
I think the professors will let you know if they care. Typically APA or MLA has been fine. I think anytime I've ever even seen it brought up is just they'll say in the syllabus, do this, and just make sure you do that.
Yeah, it's professor specific, not department wide.
Cool. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.